Very much for coming to my channel, and it is really privileged, and I really feel very good about that. The topic is very important, and I see your humbly approaching me and accepting my offer. It was very good as well from an Islamic scholar. It is difficult to find someone like you and with this behavior in these days. As far as I see, people don't bother to have this kind of conversation, answering all the questions without asking any question. That was really good. I mean, as far as I have seen from you, that was good, at least, I have to say. I have to give a credit for that. Thank you very much. I think
most welcome.
Other people also should repeat the same similar behavior. If the truth is the matter, then we have to discuss everything that we know.
Right.
And so let me introduce you to my viewers shortly. Did I pronounce correctly? Shehzad Saleem, is that correct? Shehzad Saleem?
Yes, correct. But in fact, I wanted to know how should I pronounce your name? It's
Gökmen Altay. Gökmen Altay.
Okay, Gökmen Altay.
Altay, yes, Altay. In general, people
Altay.
call me Altay, yes. Gökmen Altay.
Okay,
the Turkish name, it is not that easy to pronounce for others, I understand.
Yeah.
Let me introduce Dr. Shehzad Saleem. Dr. Shehzad Saleem is currently a research fellow at Al-Mawrid Institute in Pakistan. He has a bachelor's in electrical engineering from UAT Lahore, Pakistan, and holds a PhD in the history of Quran from University of Wales, United Kingdom. He has authored books in Islam, Quran, Hadith, and character building. And the topic, he has two important books that is related to the current topic, which is the preservation of Quran and history of Quran we are going to discuss. That is History of the Quran, a concise study in 2019 he has published. And another one, the larger one, the extended version of that one, more academic I think, that is History of the Quran, a critical study which was published in 2020 as far as I see. So welcome again to my program. So we are going to discuss preservation of Quran, if the Quran is preserved or not fully, and history of Quran. And as I had asked you, I want this program to be like simple. I mean, for an average Muslim person who doesn't know that much about the terminology, who cannot comprehend all the stuff going around, but want to understand, if the Quran is preserved, if so, what are the basic proofs? What are the convincing proofs that we can have first for ourselves, and we can also narrate to others that are asking to us. When I started learning about it in a few weeks ago from your lectures especially, I learned a lot of new information, and your conclusion is different than the traditional conclusion. I think that's very important. The traditional conclusion wasn't that convincing to me, I have to admit. But when I come across with yours, it was very convincing. So if I had a kind of million subscribers, if I wanted to have a guest, I would like to have you first because of your expertise on that and a very unique and very convincing conclusion. That's what I want to say. Let me start with your conclusion first. So your conclusion is in the preservation of Quran. You say, my view argues from your article, I get that, in favor of a single valid qraat of the Quran. So qraat means recitation, one oral Quran. Transmitted through tawatur, which means repeated from many people, not only a few line of people that we know. So all other readings, because there are many readings as well, do not qualify to be given the status of the Quran because none of them is mutawatir. Yeah. So this is the different idea and opposing idea to the tradition. As opposed to tradition, you do not consider the other 4 manuscripts, which are used by 3% of Muslims in most 11 North African countries. Is that right? You don't consider them Quran?
That's correct. That I have tried to explain how they have come into existence in my book, in my research, but obviously they don't go right back to the Prophet and they do not actually qualify as mutawatir transmissions. And you see, you have to understand that these mutawatir, when we say what a transmission is mutawatir, it is this mutawatir transmission which gives a certain transmission that certitude, which means that it renders it beyond any error. Any other transmission which is not mutawatir or it is less than mutawatir, the possibility of error is always there. And it is only the qiraat al-amma, which our Salaf would call it, the first generation scholars, they would call this the qiraat al-amma, or the qiraat of the masses. And only this qiraat actually occupies the status of tawatur. And hence it has been invested with certitude, which means that it could not have been altered because the transmission or the nature of transmission of tawatur is such that it yields certitude. And to understand this, we just need to see that the way established history is transmitted in our own secular areas. For example, how do we know that Jesus was a prophet, or how do we know that Alexander the Great did what he did, or how do we know that there was a person by the name of Aristotle or Socrates? So you see, there are certain things which we call established history, in which so many people convey a certain fact, and when they convey that fact, it's not something of their interpretation, it is a visual evidence that they're conveying. In the case of the Quran, it was through the orality in which it was transmitted. So just as established history is transmitted, and we are absolutely sure that there is no error in that, no one can doubt that, for example, people like Shakespeare, or maybe people like Geoffrey Chaucer or Milton, or you can name any historical personality. So just as the way their circumstances and their biographies have been transmitted by such large people that they existed on a very similar way, we have to understand that the Quran has been transmitted through tawatur, and for the common man, you can just call it generation to generation transmission. So an easier name for tawatur would be generation to generation transmission, in which a whole generation transmits something to the next generation, and so on and so forth. So this is how the Quran was actually transmitted, and this is the only recitation that we are aware of, that I have in my research tried to establish, that the recitation which exists in 97% of the Muslim Ummah, which has that generation to generation transmission property. And therefore, and it goes back to the Prophet himself. And for this reason, we conclude that this is the only valid recitation of the Quran. And this is, in fact, proven from the Quran itself. I mean, there's one thing that you prove a transmission through secular means. And once you establish that, you go into the Quran and you find out certain verses of the Quran which also speak something in favor of this transmission. And I've actually reproduced a research of a very, very prodigious scholar of the subcontinent by the name of Hamiduddin Farahi, who died in 1930. And he actually directed our attention to certain Quranic verses, which actually lay out this whole history of the Quran in the words of the Quran. So we first established the Quran through external means, for example, through this tawatur, through this generation to generation transmission. Once this generation to generation transmission actually certifies that this is the book of God, in the next step, we consult the book of God itself, and we find out that the story of Quran's collection and transmission is something on which the Quran itself has spoken at length. And therefore, it's like one corroborating the other, one testifying to the other.
I want to elaborate some of those things that you mentioned, but before that, let's clarify what do we mean by the preservation of Quran? What exactly do we mean? When we say Quran is preserved, there are three options I saw so far. Some say word by word, some say letter by letter, some say just the main meaning, but there might be some slight variations. What is your understanding on that? According to the verse, I think 15:9. So first of all, why do we Muslims say that Quran is preserved 100%? And what do we mean exactly by that? Let's clarify this thing.
So in my understanding, the preservation means that exactly the same Quran which was given to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, letter to letter, dot to dot, word to word, has been preserved in its original format and has been transmitted from generation to generation. It is not that the meaning has been preserved. It is not that there have been small variations. I have tried to argue in my book that this is not the case. The Quran that was revealed to the Prophet exactly in the way it was revealed is found today in the Muslim Ummah in exactly the same shape, the same format, the same words, the same letters, and the same dots. This is how I understand it. And this is how I've tried to actually argue in favor of it and try to prove it as well.
Question that comes to my mind, how can we maybe word to word, I think that makes sense already, that brings all the message 100%. But when you say letter to letter, do we have a proof that we have letter to letter Quran that we can read and we can, I also, many manuscripts, they differentiate among them with letters. There are so many words, they have different type of writings, but they are the same words. So how do you reconcile that in that case? Where is that Quran that all the letters are there, exact same letters?
So you see, if you're talking about the way in which certain Qurans are written, for example, spellings, so they have evolved just as spellings have evolved in so many languages. When I say letter to letter, I mean actually the words, the way they are composed of a certain letter. For example, if a word like zaraba is composed of dha, ra, and ba, you'll find it everywhere, and it has those three letters. The only thing is that those three letters might be written differently in certain scripts. You see, there is one thing which is called the type of script, which can vary from country to country, from script to script. And the orthography of the Quran is a whole subject in which specialists, they change the orthographies. For example, we have various forms of scripts. The earliest Qurans were written in the Hijazi script, which is also called the Mile script. Then we had the Kufic Qurans, and so on and so forth. Different styles of writing came into being. So I'm not referring to those. What I'm saying is the components of every word. When I refer to a letter, I actually refer to the components of a word. The letters are composed, I mean, a word is composed of letters. So I say that every word has the same letters. They may be written differently. For example, the medial alif at times was not written in early manuscripts, and it was just pronounced. And similarly, there are other examples as well. But as I said, that doesn't make a difference because of the fact that these scripts continue to change, but the words always were the same.
That's clear then. From that point of view, I understand it's like word by word, but letters, there might be some slight changes if it doesn't change the meaning of the word or the writing of the word in general. What about the sound? I mean, the oral recitation. When they say a word, when it was revealed, is there any possibility that sound might slightly change as well? I mean, like the letters, the longer alif, something like that. I don't know the Arabic, by the way. I'm just...
Yes, that is possible. You see, that is what we call accent. Accent is something which can always vary. For example, as a Pakistani, I would speak English in a different accent. You are a Turkish person, you might be speaking English, but you're still speaking English. You have a Turkish accent, I have a Pakistani accent, someone else might have an Indian accent or a British accent. The accent is the intonation, the way you pronounce words, but we do not change the word or the letter itself that we are pronouncing. So the sound can change because accents change. I'm sure if you're in Turkey, within Turkey, there are so many internal accents as well. But the word is the same. But the way maybe a person in Istanbul would be announcing a particular word, you might not be having the same pronunciation in maybe Ankara or maybe some other city. So it's like saying that the way we read words, they change. And that is not a problem, because in that case, the word is not changing. We are just pronouncing it differently.
As far as I understand, the word-by-word preservation is the safest narration that I can say in this case. Those variations, people might argue on them, but yeah, word-by-word is, I think, 100% is okay to say Quran is preserved. Then the question is, okay, then this is your claim. It's mutawatir. It means it is repeated by masses of people to the other next generations. What is the proof? I mean, why should I believe this? I mean, why should anyone believe this thing? What is
because you start off with today. You see, you work back. You see that we find generations of people. We have seen at least 2 or 3 generations in our own lives. We see how the Quran has been transmitted today, and you actually project it back and see it has been happening. Otherwise, if there was something which had happened differently, history would have reported that. History would have said, okay, now at a certain point of time, in a certain country or in a certain territory, something different has happened, and it started off whatever we are hearing today, whatever we are seeing today. But in the case of the Quran, we find that the generation to generation transfer, which is occurring today, goes right back, and we don't find any negation of this in history. So you see, this positive way in which no one says or no one utters a word against it, and the way it goes back all the way to the Prophet is proof enough of the fact that the nature of tawatur that we have, it has started right from the Prophet. You see, one property of tawatur is, or generation to generation transmission is, that if that has started to occur, it cannot die away. It goes right back. I mean, unless there is some interruption from an external agency, maybe a war, maybe a global pandemic or something which stops that, which of course has to be reported in history. So this property of generation to generation transfer is that once it starts, it cannot stop, because you see, it's like saying that millions of people are transmitting this a certain thing to millions of other people. So there has to be some big thing, some sort of catastrophe, some emergency, which can be reported in history, or which should be reported in history, to tell us, well, this never happened, and there was a certain time in which there was a break, and things started to go off from there. So I think we have to start off with what we have today. 97% of the Muslim Ummah, and I would call it 100%, because the 3% which is not reading the Quran the way, or not corroborating the same Quran, I have tried to show that that particular Quran is actually not based on tawatur. All those 4 Qurans are not based on tawatur. So in my humble opinion, I can say that all the Ummah, the only Quran they have with tawatur is the qiraat al-amma, with which we are aware of today, and it goes right back to the Prophet.
Okay, then your proof, one of the proofs is, okay, this is what we have, and there is no difference among those recitations. It means, from a statistical point of view, there are about 1.8 billion Muslim people around the world. If I go to that 97% population, around 7 billion people, and if I randomly select enough amount of samples from different countries, and listen to them and record them, they would recite the exact same Quran, right? This is
exact same.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Even if their writings might be different on their manuscript.
Yeah, because doesn't matter.
Okay, I think that makes sense, because this is quite a significant proof, because let's say in the history somewhere, it's 1400 years. If someone had changed a little bit, a few words, even if it's passed to the next generation, it would just be millions of people right now. We would see different recitations among them as well, something like
Absolutely.
that. I think it's a quite strong proof statistically, I can say. Okay, then we can say at least 97% of Muslims recite the exact same recitation, that is the Quran we mean. So, by the way, I think we don't mean any manuscript when we say the Quran. When we say the Quran, we mean the recitation, the verbal,
Right.
said, the Quran. Because some people, like the missionaries, argue on that. They bring some verses and they argue it must be a book. They don't even consider the 15:9 as the proof of preservation of Quran. I mean, the God declares, "I'm going to protect and guard it." So, what do you think on that verse? I mean, is it the main verse that we can say God promised us to protect, and this is the proof?
So you see, when we study the preservation of the Quran, there are 2 sides of that. One is the religious side, which means that we have to believe by our faith. And the other is the secular side, in which we don't have to go by faith. So I have just so far talked about the secular side. Even if that Quranic verse was not there, this nature of transmission is such that it establishes the text of the Quran. Whatever is within the text of the Quran, like this verse 15, Surah 15, which says, "Inna nahnu nazzilna zikra wa inna lahu lahafizun," is only adding to which is already found outside it. So, for example, a person who believes in the Quran, he knows, okay, the Quran which has been given to him is something which has been protected by God. But for other people who, for example, don't believe in the Quran, for them we will not present this verse, and we will present the way the Quran has been transmitted. And once we establish the authenticity of the Quran, we will then go into the verse. We will then go inside the Quran and say, okay, look, this verse has also said the same thing. And we will also refer them to some other parts of the Quran in which the preservation of the Quran and the transmission of the Quran has been mentioned. So I would say that if you have to talk to the missionaries, it would not be right to cite a Quranic verse. We first need to establish that the Quran itself has been preserved in not a religious way, but in a way in which things are, let me give you an example. Languages are preserved through tawatur. Any language, pick up any language. You pick up Spanish, German, Turkish, English. So you see the way the words are transmitted from generation to generation. You do not need to find out the meaning of simple words which you hear from your surroundings, which you read in your newspapers. It's like a living tradition in which this language is being conveyed to you. So just as a language is transmitted to you, and you have to consult a dictionary occasionally when you are trying to write or maybe trying to improve your vocabulary. Otherwise, the basic meaning of a language is something which is there with you. Even what is written in the dictionary is something which is always corroborated by scholars, and they say, because you see, dictionaries have been compiled by scholars through this tradition, through this oral tradition, in which a certain word was spoken in a certain meaning. So I think in order to make our missionaries or people who criticize the transmission of the Quran, make them understand, we need to, I think we are falling short of explaining the transmission of the Quran. I think it's more our fault. And we need to elaborate further and in a better way, giving them examples that we are not talking about a religious or a faith issue in which you have to believe something and look in the Quran. But what we are trying to tell you is, just as languages are preserved in a very similar way, it is a very miraculous book and one of a kind which is preserved in the very same way, through oral transmission, through memorization, and in a manner in which one generation has transmitted it orally to the next generation, and the written part is actually following the oral part. And it's like, although now it goes hand in hand, but earlier on it was the oral transmission which was always which always held in dominance. And even today, when you see a written manuscript of the Quran or a written book form of the Quran, it is always the huffaz or the memorizers who say, okay, yes, this is according to my memory, the way how I heard it from my teacher and he heard it from his teacher. So you see, it's always that oral transmission. And I think this is one of the reasons that we have perhaps failed to properly argue the transmission of the Quran, because because of the existence of these variant readings and various masahif, and because of the fact that this transmission, if it is mutawatir, then of course the obvious answer is that if there is mutawatir, then why is it that you have multiple Qurans? So the problem I think here is that I would say we Muslims have not been able to argue the case of the Quran in the way it should be, I think, in my humble opinion, towards people who have these doubts about its transmission.
Yes, I will come to that part as well. I think that's important. They make a self-damage as far as I see. Let me ask you this question too. How to draw the historical path from Quran, recitation of Quran, al-qraat, al-amma, to the Prophet Muhammad? I mean, just we have the oral transmission, and then in history, how is there any records that we have?
So there are historical records, and I have cited them in my book as well, which tell us that our earliest scholars and our earliest authorities, they called this qiraat, the final qiraat. As you know, the Quran was recompiled and it was rearranged in the Arzai Akhira, and our earliest scholars called the rearranged Quran, this new recital, as the qiraat al-amma. So I have cited sources, even Imam Bukhari, a person like his stature in the 3rd century, he has actually used this word in some of his narratives. Earlier than him, we have the genre of Ma'anil Quran, in which Akhfash and Farra and some of these scholars, they have used this word. And then even before that, we have Abu Abdurrahman al-Sulami, person who was actually the teacher of Asim, who has used this word for the qiraat of the Muhajirun and the Ansar and all of them. And he says this is what we call the qiraat al-amma. So I think the word is something which this is found externally in our history as well, but we have historical records as well.
Okay, then I think in the end we also need a manuscript in the current time. Without that, we cannot recite in general, most Muslims. So, and as far as I know, the mushaf that 97% of Muslims use Hafs mushaf that you refer to al-qraat, al-amma. So how do you connect al-qraat, al-amma recitation to the Hafs manuscript?
So this is the biggest thing. This is a big problem which I particularly quote my own teacher Javed Ahmad Hamidi, who has actually endeavored to solve it. But you see, the problem is that our traditional scholars, they do not relate the qiraat al-amma to the qiraat al-hafs. So this is what we have tried to say. I mean, this is our thesis or our conclusion. As far as our common scholars are concerned, they don't even quote what qiraat al-amma is. This is something which is buried in their books. This is lost to posterity. Wow. What they actually generally say is, they will say the qiraat of Hafs, the qiraat of Warsh, or the qiraat of Qalun. So you see, the qiraat al-amma is something which has lost any mention in their works. It is we, in our approach, who have said that because of the fact that Hafs actually tried to copy, or you can say that copy the lahja or the accent of the Arabs without using his ihktiyar. I mean, this is again an advanced term in which the qaris would use their own judgment to select between various recitals. And this judgment, when they used to exercise it, it is called ihktiyar, or the choice that they could have made. And of course, that could be something which you may be asking later. But the problem, as I said, is that our general scholars, our traditional scholars, they do not relate the qiraat and the qiraat al-amma in any way, because al-qiraat al-amma does not find any significant mention in their works.
Right. Since you said Hafs didn't choose any ikhtiyar, when I was going through some Twitter accounts, those Western scholars, I think one of them was your critic. As far as I remember, I don't remember exactly what he said. He has made one ikhtiyar for one word. Do you remember such critique from your?
Yes, that is Zaf and Zorf.
Can you elaborate? You see,
that doesn't make any difference, because that is a spelling issue. You see, the ikhtiyar relates to a wider thing in which you change the word word order could be, or you add some syllable to it. So this is a spelling issue. The Zorf and Zaf, which is in Surah Rum,
that was the word.
So it's only a matter of how, both pronunciations do exist. Okay. And if you adopt one of them, it doesn't matter. Either of them is okay. So right. I think I told him, if I correctly remember, that this is not an example that you can quote. This is something which is already, I acknowledge that this can happen, because it's not an ikhtiyar in itself. It is something which is already allowed. It's called the morphological difference, and in morphology, in spellings, you can have variable spelling for the same word.
Okay, it doesn't change the word at all, meaning at all, so it doesn't
change. No, not at all.
That's great to clarify, because I had seen that. I was thinking about that as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go to the last question I can ask you about your study. Are there any issues or blurred points still that are left in your mind to investigate further, or are you 100% sure that Quran is fully preserved as your conclusion, based on evidences in your PhD, in your study so far?
Yes, it's almost 20 years. I started in 1999 when I started teaching this subject, and I think in these 21 years, I have, alhamdulillah, I find myself very, very assured and quite certain that this is the case, and the conclusion which I have reached so far, people can criticize and I can correct myself, but so far I find it to be absolutely correct and valid.
Okay, so what about the Birmingham manuscript, which is very famous? As far as I see the carbon dating, the most strongest part of the date is going to the life of the Prophet Muhammad. That's very strong for me. Not the tails, but the middle point goes to his lifetime. So it is a very important point for the Quran's preservation. Did you read from 1 to, I think there are 3 chapters in that we have in hand. And does it match to the exact Hafs manuscript or al-qraat al-amma, or does it match to something else, that the other manuscripts?
Yes, I have read that. There are just 4 pages. It's not 3 chapters, just 4 pages actually. Okay. And all of them are exactly as the qiraat al-amma. And in fact, Dr. Alba Fazli, who is the person who actually discovered those pages and folios, I met her last year in San Diego at a Quran conference in November. And she said that she has some more as well, and she intends to publish them. But so far, I don't find they've been published. But the ones which have been published, the 4 pages, it's part of Surah Kahf and Surah Maryam. You'll find that they're exactly the same as the Qiraat al-Amma today. So
that is a material evidence from the time of Prophet Muhammad, most likely, that matches exactly to al-qraat al-amma, right? I think that's quite a big thing in that case.
Yeah, but I don't give it many importance. You see, to me, it's of very, very secondary importance. The reason is that if you find this, you are bound to find some other manuscripts later on which do not have the Qiraat al-Amma, because of the fact that variant readings existed, and as I've explained, that they have an origin. So you might find another Quran maybe in the coming years which does not have the Qiraat al-Amma. And now it would be, of course, a big news when some such Quran is discovered. Because you see, what is happening is that we are basing our evidence on manuscripts. And I think that manuscripts is not the right way or the right place in which you have your primary evidence. Your primary evidence is the oral Qiraat and the Qiraat al-Amma. At times you'll find the Qiraat al-Amma written in the form of Masahif, and at times you'll not find it. You'll find other Qiraats written and mentioned. And you can date them very close to the Prophet as well. Then what will happen? You see, just as something which is being argued in favor of the Quran, suddenly you'll find something which is being argued against the Quran. So I think manuscript evidence is not the primary evidence. regarding the preservation of the Quran. It's just a supporting evidence, and that too at times. So we should not make it a primary evidence. Otherwise, I can clearly say, and I have a very strong feeling that very soon it will be refuted.
I agree with you, but in the end, since we have something materially in hand, that supports
Right.
al-qraat al-amma. For al-qraat al-amma, I think it is a secondary but very strong evidence. Very strong
Right.
secondary evidence.
So I would say that it's a secondary evidence. It should not be regarded as a primary evidence.
Okay, yeah, I agree with you. But it's very good to have something material and to have in hand what we say, that's the oral tradition, and at this, because this is not cherry picked. This is a kind of statistical sample, randomly came up, and it perfectly kind of provides support evidence to your hypothesis. I think, yeah, that assures at least, not proves, but assures. That's good. Good to know that, yeah. Okay, let's talk about the other manuscripts then. So, as you mentioned, there are other 4 manuscripts as well. In total, there are 5 manuscripts. You claim, and I agree with you. It's very convincing that your explanation, logically as well. One of them is correct. That is the Quran, Hafs Musaf that we are using, 97% of Muslims. But what about 3% of the Muslims they are using in the 11 North African countries almost? Those 4 manuscripts. The question is, what is the most dramatic example for the difference? I mean, let's say for their case, if they accept, the tradition accept them as correct as well, then in that case, what can we see as the most dramatic difference among those manuscripts? What is our problem then? What would be their problem, not our, but the tradition's problem, let's say?
So first, I'll just try to make the small correction that they should not be called manuscripts, they are versions. Versions mean they are separately published, they have been written and read. So it's not just a question of a particular manuscript, it's a whole, it's a version which has been published separately. So there are some blatant change in meanings as well. Of course, the doctrine of Tawheed never changes, or you don't get any drastic change in our aqaid or the faith. But in ahkam, in the Sharia part, you find certain things. For example, if you accept the qiraat of Nafi, you'll find that the wuzu verses, which of course are mentioned in a way which says arjulakum ilal karbain, and then we have arjulekum. So if you accept the qiraat of Hafs or the qiraat al-amma, in that case you'll have to do in the case of the qiraat of Nafi, you'll have to do masa. If you do masa instead of washing your feet, that would be enough. Whereas in the case of qiraat al-amma, washing the feet during wuzu is essential. So one difference is that washing and doing masa can result. Then there are other differences. For example, in the case of these inheritance shares, the shares of inheritance, in which the verse of Kalala in verse 13 or 14 of Surah Nisa, the way you interpret it, we always add the word min al which means akhun walahu akhun aw ukhtum min al which means if he has a brother or a sister from the previous mother, which the mother has actually brought forward. So this is a place which has been attributed that the qiraat of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is something which will settle the affairs, and it is actually adduced by all the scholars, because they think that this does not make sense, because the shares of the brothers and sisters are mentioned twice in the Quran, once at the end of Surah Nisa and once during these verses. And they think that there is a difference between these two brothers and sisters. And one of them they say are the real ones, and the other ones are the step ones which the mother has brought with them. And then there are differences, for example, in qattala and yuqattilu. You kill someone in an exemplary way, and you just punish someone when you kill him. And then we have differences like, for example, which are not very significant. For example, waw and fa, and we have such differences between singular and plural. For example, in Surah Tahrim, we have saddaqat bi kalimati rabbiha wa kutubihi, which means Maryam, she actually attested to the books of God. However, in another qiraat, we have kitabihi, which means she attested to the book of God, not the books of God. So you see, there are times these doctrinal differences, at times these ahkam differences, but all in all, it is not that they change the aqaid or the faith part in any way, I would say.
But there are differences in the words, because the general Muslim belief is, we have the exact same Quran. But okay, we have the exact same Quran, but those 3% in that case has versions of. I don't want to say the Quran, but I have to say manuscript, even if it is wrong because it's not Quran. I don't want to.
No, I say it's versions because you see, versions means there is a whole book which has been published. Manuscript would just mean just one thing and an isolated thing. Version means it's like a published thing which is being handed down for the last 12 centuries. And for example, all of Morocco is reading the version of Nafi.
Okay.
It's like
the versions of the recitation, in that case, the versions of recitation.
The versions of the Quran. It's the version of the Quran, because you see the Quran that we have, the Quran of Hafs, you can say, is a version which goes back to the Prophet. It's a complete Quran. So version means a complete Quran, which is different from the Quran that we know. So it's like having a yeah.
I see. I think you are an academic, you are speaking probably maybe in the sense, but as an average Muslim, since if there is one Quran, there is no other Quran, in my opinion. And I cannot call the others as other versions of Quran. I don't want to call them anyway, because it is not true, in my opinion. But maybe academically you might speak like that. It's okay. So I want to call them something like this: other manuscript, other versions of manuscripts, or other versions of recitations. Maybe I can say.
Okay.
If there's one Quran, there's one Quran. I mean, I cannot accept there are versions of Quran. It doesn't match in my simple English and simple understanding. Let's say the topic. Okay, let's ask this question as well. What are the most challenging critics to your conclusion from your peers? I mean, academic peers, let's say Western scholars especially. Did they still oppose any of your answers? Because I saw you refuted them. They critiqued your article, you refuted them as well. They didn't reply back as far as I saw. I also asked them in Twitter, we have still objections, they didn't reply me. And if so, if they don't agree with you, what is their main problem and your response to their persistent objection?
So I think I try to place myself in their shoes, and I think the problem that they might be facing, and a very genuine problem, is a very heavy reliance on the manuscripts tradition, a very heavy reliance on the written tradition, and it's somehow they cannot come to grips, or they cannot adjust with this notion that the Quran is a spoken word, it is an oral word, and they think orality is something which is very dodgy, which can be corrupted. However, written evidence is something which cannot be corrupted. So you see, they have placed all their reliance on written evidence, and to them an oral tradition is meaningless. And similarly, the terms like tawatur or generation to generation transfer, if I use their terms, I think they are meaningless to them. They think there's no such thing as tawatur, or there's no such thing as certitude. All we have are written accounts of the Quran, and we have to rely on visual evidence. So you see, it's like the modern age says that you cannot rely anything but on visual evidence, on empirical evidence. And to them, this manuscript evidence is the most empirical that you can get. And I think this is where I have tried my best, and I'm still thinking, I think I'm falling short, my colleagues are falling short, in order to infiltrate into their brain, and it's like resetting them and trying to make them feel that actually they have gone wrong fundamentally. It's like at the starting point, one is this route and one is the other route. So because they have adopted the other route and we have adopted the other route, so the farther we have gone, you cannot reconcile the differences later on. You have to reconcile them at the root, at the starting point. So I try to bring them back to the starting point and say, well, you see, there is another way out, and you should think in another way. And I think that I have tried my best, but I think I have failed not to properly, perhaps, catch their attention. Or I also think that in some cases they have not been very serious in their critique, because the book that they have read, because I presented, I met these two gentlemen. I have great respect for them, Dr. Sidky and Dr. Marijn. I think both of them are Dutch, if I'm not mistaken. At least Marijn is a Dutchman. They are very young scholars. I have a lot of respect for them. And I think that somehow for such facts, you have to sit across and thrash out these things. Twitter messages and these tweets where every person jumps in and the discussion goes from this angle and that angle, you just cannot control the discussion. So I think I even wrote to them, if I remember correctly, and I said that I would like to have a one-to-one conversation with you, maybe on Skype, maybe in any other way. And the purpose is not to convince you. The purpose is to understand each other. But I didn't get a reply, so I did not pursue it. So I think these things have to be dealt with in an academic way, in a one-to-one conversation, in a very gentle way, in a polite way, in not a dogmatic way, in not an imposing way in which you're trying to make the other person realize that he is wrong. No, that is not the case. We're just trying to communicate and to put across our point so that the other person understands where we are coming from. And I think unless this barrier is somehow overcome, and I get a serious audience, serious scholars who might be interested. So I left that discussion. I think this was in January this year. And I realized that Twitter is not the right medium for such discussions.
Yes, exactly. You're right. It is not the right place. It is a place to, get the offer, get some engagement, and the rest should be on like video, in person to person. I will bring this to their attention as well if they like to have a conversation with you on this point. That would be great if they like to do that again, in case. This is for the critics. You are open to discuss with them in person, but they didn't accept. I think we should bring their attention again just to make sure they know it. Okay, that was good to know, good to declare again. Let's talk about some manuscripts. I mean, I keep hearing, because as an average Muslim, I don't get all those terms. I sometimes confuse, I have to say. Can you clarify the most cited or trusted manuscript? This is, I think, Uthmanic manuscript people keep saying. Regarding the current and past time versions, including 1924, the Cairo manuscript, I think it's Uthmani manuscript, I think it's that one as well. So is there any difference between Uthmanic manuscript and Hafs manuscript that we know? But can you clarify those terms? What exactly are they?
So you see, first of all, I would like to clarify that all the Uthmanic manuscripts, history has claimed, various scholars have claimed there were 5, some say there were 6, 7, it goes right up to 9 or 10. None of them exists today. What we have are claims, mere claims, for example, that the Uthmanic copies are there. We have a claim from the Turkish authorities at the Topkapi Museum. We have a claim from the Tashkent Museum in Russia. We have a claim from Mashhad in Iran. We have a claim from the Khudayf Library in Cairo. But if you examine the script, you'll realize that none of these scripts is the same script, because the original script, as I said, is the Hijazi script, which is a slanting script. These Qurans that we have today, which many people claim that they are the Uthmanic Qurans, they are at best copies of copies of copies of copies. So it's like the third, fourth generation. It's not the original Uthmanic Musahif, because, as I said, you can easily judge the Uthmanic Musahif because of their handwriting, the way they are written. And as far as the Cairo manuscript is concerned, or the Cairo Quran, in which the King Fuad actually in 1924, he summoned a whole committee and he said that he would like to standardize the Quran. It is exactly the same Quran, which the al-qraat al-amma, as I would say, and I'd like to popularize this term as well. He just had it written on a state level, at the country level, at the government level, so that he could actually spread and disseminate the Quran as far as possible. And this happened by so many other rulers as well. In fact, Usman radiyallahu anhu, in his own times, as I've argued, was spreading the Quran. He was not making separate manuscripts or maybe separate copies or correcting certain copies. What he was doing is he was spreading the Quran, which was already there, for the benefit of those who were converting to Islam, so that they could read from the manuscript, for the children who were growing up so they could read from the manuscript. So he was just spreading that whole message of the Quran in written form, the whole text of the Quran. In a very similar way, the King Fuad of Egypt did the same thing in 1924. And it was a service to the Quran that he did. And today, the Qurans that we have, most of them conform. We have some Saudi Qurans which are written slightly differently in a different script. But other than that, as far as the qiraat that they preserve, the Shafat Quran is exactly the qiraat al-amma.
What about the connection between Hafs mushaf, Hafs manuscript, and Usman manuscript? When people say that, what is that connection? What is the difference?
As I said, Hafs didn't have a mushaf. Hafs has a qiraat.
Okay.
You see, you have to make a difference. There is a qiraat of Hafs, the qiraat of Nafi, the qiraat of Warsh. And similarly, as far as the Uthmanic qiraat is concerned, we don't call it the Uthmanic qiraat. We call it the Uthmanic mushaf. So one is a mushaf and the other is a qiraat.
And the terminology is being used wrongly among the people because we say Hafs mushaf in general or Hafs manuscript, but
I mean, it's like taking certain leverage. It's like using it in a way in which you have the same thing in mind, but you broaden the term. You give it more meaning to it. You broaden the meaning. And I would not say it's wrong. I would just say it's technically not correct.
Yeah, okay. Okay, in the Tanzil.net website, there's a committee. I think they have voluntarily made computer-friendly version of the Quran. They have written down to make sure there is no error because there were some problems in the characters. I don't know if you check that. They have Uthmanic version manuscript, and also they have simple version. Are you aware of them? I mean, are there any difference between them, or do they both represent the Hafs recitation?
So which website are you talking about?
Tanzil.net.
Tanzil. Oh yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, I've seen that. So I saw it many years ago actually, because it's not a new website. It's an old one, and I think that they have this, as far as I know, the qiraat al-amma manuscript there. I mean, the qiraat al-amma, the manuscript which represents the qiraat al-amma.
Okay. Also, I saw a recent news from Saudi Arabia. If you heard about it, I don't know. Let me bring that to your attention. They say there are errors in the Uthmanic manuscript. Currently, there are some slight errors, I mean, on the writings, but there are too many of them. So they call to rewriting that, something like that. Are you aware of, is there such issue in the Uthmanic manuscripts they have?
Yes, it is absolutely correct. There are many scribal errors in which an extra wa or extra ya or extra alif.
Even the modern, right? Modern Uthmanic manuscript.
Right. They are. And they have actually indicated that extra letter by a small circle which they write on top of that word, which is extra. So there are many places in the Uthmanic, and this actually in the 9th century, in the time of Ibn Khaldun, he also was very passionate. He wanted that we should rewrite these masahif and we just should eliminate these scribal errors. But people did not listen to him, and they said that this is what the Sahaba wrote, and we cannot change what the Sahaba wrote. We do know that these are errors, and we have put those circles on those errors, and we can just disregard them because we don't read them orally. They're just written. They're like historical material. So Ibn Khaldun was sidelined, and no one listened to him. And now we hear more voices which actually say the same thing. But I think that unless there is a wider consensus, and all the Muslim Ummah, or maybe at least the representative scholars of each country, they get together and form an opinion, I don't think that one single country can do it, because unless all the Muslim countries accept this, I don't think it's something very viable.
Do they not consider the effort, the project Tanzil.net as the valid, as the reference? Because they already did something like that, and they have a kind of error-free version, at least for the last 10 years. They didn't find any new bugs or update.
So I cannot comment on that because I have not seen the Tanzil.net in that fashion. What I saw is not the script, but the qiraat. So you see, the script is different from the qiraat. Qiraat, as I said, it overlooks these errors, and you broadly see that it is the same qiraat. So I think this is a very minor issue, which can, of course, take our attention. But because we know that there is something which is wrong, and for 14 centuries it has thrived, and we have just marked it and overlooked it. So I think that for an error-free version to be synthesized, I would again say that this should come into existence after wider consultation between all these Muslim countries, 55 or 56 of them, in which some consensus is reached. And if we don't have consensus, I think we should not touch them, because if we otherwise what will happen is that some countries will publish one type of mushaf and the other will have the other type. and the people who will suffer would be the next generations who would not know where to go and where not to go.
Okay, let's come back to traditional narrative. So let's make it this clear here again for the viewers who didn't know. Actually, I guess mostly wouldn't know. What is the standard narrative regarding the preservation of Quran in tradition?
So you see, regarding the standard narrative, although I don't think there is one single standard narrative, but broadly, if I can make sense of a standard narrative, it says that the Quran has more than one version, and all these versions are acceptable if they confine to certain standards. They have actually outlined three standards. That if a qiraat is grammatically correct, if it is in consonance with one of the Uthmanic codices, and if the sanad or the isnad, the chain of narration, goes back to the Prophet. Any qiraat which has these properties is acceptable to the Muslim Ummah, and the Quran can be read, and we can read the Quran in the prayer on these qiraat, and they have found sanction from the Prophet himself. This is what the standard version says. So it argues in favor of multiplicity of qiraat, and as far as the collection of the Quran is concerned, it says that the arrangement of the Quran is something in which the surahs are arranged is a matter which was done by the Sahaba, not by God himself. So they say that the verses within the surah, they have been divinely arranged. But the surahs in the Quran were arranged at the time of Uthman by the opinion of the Sahaba, not by God. So they say that the arrangement of the Quran, the surahs of the Quran, is not tawqifi. It's ijtihadi, is what they say. And at the same time, they say that all the qiraat of the Quran are acceptable if they qualify, if they conform to these three standards which I just outlined. And this is something which is I think almost a consensus. And then they classify that there are Shah's qiraat, which means that, for example, they do not conform to these three standards, and they might conform to two of these standards, for example. Then they will use those qiraat as tafsir. For example, the atonement of breaking oath is that you fast for 3 days. One of the atonements is. So because there is a Shah's qiraat which says that 3 consecutive days, it should not be any 3 days, it should be 3 consecutive days. So what they'll do is they'll use a Shah's qiraat as a tafsir, not as something which is Quran per se, but as a tafsir of the Quran. So this is how, I mean, I have tried to summarize in 3 steps the standard, the traditional narrative.
I think they accept 10 different qiraats, right? Do we know the number of qiraats they accept as valid?
So as I said, there is no standard here because there are different scholars in different periods of time. The common thing which all these scholars in 14th centuries have is that those 3 standards, once a qiraat conforms to those 3 standards, it is acceptable. So at times it is from those 10, at times it is from 14, at times it is from the 7 famous ones. So this is something which is the work of scholars, that they have collected at times 7 famous ones, at times 10, at times 14. That's a separate endeavor, separate effort that they have made. But the bottom line is every qiraat is acceptable if it conforms to these 3 standards, whether it's from 10 or 14 or even beyond them.
Okay, then the question is, they accept some words change because, as you mentioned, although the meaning doesn't change too much, but slightly changes. And I have seen one of your videos, almost all the pages had differences among those manuscripts in that case. So they accept all of them. I mean, what is their base to accept all of them? What do they rely on to accept all of them?
So as I said, that just as in hadith, they have a certain standard of accepting hadith. They say that the ravi, the narrator, should be zabit, he should be adil, or you can say sikha. The chain of narration should be muttasil, ittisal should be there should be no shuzuz, there should be no illa. So we have 5 standards of accepting a hadith. Any hadith, no, I'm coming to that. So just as scholars have elaborated 5 standards for acceptance of hadith, in a very similar way, they have formulated these 3 standards for the acceptance of a qiraat. And if you ask me that who is the person who has actually put forth these three, we cannot identify him, because this is something which has emerged through a collective effort, and everyone seems to have a consensus on the fact that these three standards, if they are met, then anything which is the Quran shall be accepted if it conforms to these standards. And as I said, if you ask me where these standards have come from, I have tried to trace their history, because initially the standards were different. But ultimately, I think this was probably in the 3rd or 4th century when these standards were accepted, come what may.
Is the hadith they rely on mutawatir hadith?
No. Hadith is, you see, all our hadiths are ahad. None of them can, although they stake a claim that there are certain mutawatir narratives, and they don't exist actually. So scholars like Ibn Salah and scholars like Khatib and scholars like Ibn Hajar, all of them have actually have books and written on these standards of narrative. So these standards actually tell us that this is the standard of a Sahih narrative. And the word Sahih is not the Arabic Sahih, it is a term, which means that it is technically a Sahih narrative. So for a narrative to be technically Sahih, they must conform to these 5 narratives. And for any qiraat to be technically the Quran, to be considered as the Quran, then these 3 standards have to be acceptable. So it is something which you can be easily compare.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to understand their point of view. If they rely on acceptance of different versions of qiraat, 10 qiraat, let's say, or maybe more, or maybe less. I think there's no consensus on it anyway, among them in general. But they rely on a hadith, and which is not mutawatir even, right? And
Right.
it seems doesn't make sense to me. You accept Quran, and you say this is the word of God, and if it is not, it's a big claim, and you have to pay price for it. In my opinion, it's a big claim, and they should be careful.
Right.
You rely on hadith, and which is even not mutawatir.
Right. So this is one of the contradictions, and I've tried to point this out in my research as well, that on the one hand, the standards which are put forth for the acceptance of a qiraat, none of the standards say that the qiraat should be mutawatir. None of these 3 standards. And on the other hand, you say that only that Quran is acceptable which is mutawatir. So either that is true or this is true. You cannot, the 2 cannot be true at the same time, because these 3 standards, they don't make the qiraat mutawatir. Because there is no condition in these 3 standards which says that the mutawatir qiraat will be accepted. It just says it's like a khabar wahid, it's like a ahad, it's like an isolated report, like a hadith.
Yeah.
Whereas on the other hand, all of them insist that the Quran has to be mutawatir. So, and this is a big contradiction. That on the one hand you say the Quran is mutawatir, and on the other hand you accept a certain standard which does not have mutawatir as a condition.
Yeah. And what is the book they find that hadith in? What is the latest date we can go back in history for that book? They find that hadith they rely on. I mean, they have a hadith they rely on to accept those 10 qiraats. What is the latest date we can go back to the history to find that hadith in a book? Do we have that book in hand?
No. So are you talking about the Sabatu Ahruf narrative or what? You see, there is no hadith which they are relying on. What they are relying on are these standards.
But they made from hadith, right? I think 7 Ahruf hadith, there was the...
So that's another thing. The 7 Ahruf narrative, of course, it is found in Bukhari, in some of the other books as well. And I have also analyzed the whole hadith in my research, and I've shown that not only is the text of the narrative very questionable, the chain of narration of these Sabatu Ahruf narratives are also very questionable, and it is a narrative which cannot be accepted in any way. But as far as our scholars are concerned, they use it in favor of these multiple qiraats.
Okay, that's interesting. I don't find any strong proof that they can come to that conclusion, but that they accept those 10 qiraats. And they make this kind of confusion among the world, because this is a message for all humanity, and they confuse the minds of people. I think this is a big big thing for them. In my opinion, there should be one Quran word by word, and that makes sense. And that's why when I saw your conclusion, that made perfect sense. It was very convincing. But before that, it wasn't. I had seen even for, I think, one debate, he was arguing that, okay, there are some variations like Malik, the owner of the day, in the Fatiha, the first chapter, but there's also Malik, the king of the Day of Judgment. It's similar, so it doesn't make too many difference. But in the end, what is the narrative of the Muslims? We say Quran is 100% preserved. But when you say that kind of thing along with that, it doesn't match, and
Right.
it confuses the people's mind. I think that's not
Right.
good.
Right.
That is something big that Muslims fear of them, in my opinion. What is the reaction you get from the tradition, the scholars of the, let's say, apostates of tradition to you? What do they say to you? Because you oppose them, in the end, you don't accept them. You say one, they say many crowds.
So at the moment, I haven't received any reaction because I think most of our traditional scholars, they read Urdu, and our Western scholars and our some of the scholars, Muslim scholars, which are based in the West, they read English. But a lot of our traditional scholars in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, they heavily rely on the Urdu language, and because of the fact that this book is not in Urdu as yet, so it will take time for the reaction to come, I would say. Maybe when it is translated, or maybe when someone tells them that you need to be attentive to this. You see, generally what happens is that our traditional scholars, they only lend an ear when something starts to become either popular or either convincing to the masses. It is only then when they feel that they have to maybe give a response. So I'm still waiting, and I would like that. I have sent my book to some of the very famous scholars as well, and I haven't received any responses yet. I very much would like to, but as yet, still it is awaited.
Because it's a big thing, because you denounced their Qurans, their other accepted Qurans, I mean manuscripts. But in that case, it's in your eye, in their eye, sorry, you are in a different position than me as well, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I would like to know what's their reaction. The form apostates, not the average Muslims. They wouldn't bother probably say something. But
I can tell you that they would be very angry, and they would never accept what I have said, because you see, I have critically analyzed a lot of narratives from Bukhari, from Muslim, and from some of the other canonical collections, and they don't go along with any person who would criticize or critically reject any narrative which is found in a book like Bukhari. And I think I can, without even knowing what they would, without even finding their reaction, I can predict their reaction. That they will not be, they'll not accept it in any way, and they'll be extremely put off and angry.
yeah, I hope you can in-person conversation in a civilized manner. That would maybe help one side to find the truth.
Right.
Okay, so also the topic is quite hot these days. In the last 2 months, especially in Twitter, in social media, in the YouTube as well, because of one of the scholars, Yasir Qadhi's speculative words, especially missionaries use his words from one of YouTube videos and attack to our narrative that Quran is not corrupted, it's 100% preserved. And the narrative he said is something like that. The standard narrative does not answer the very pressing questions. And also there's one thing, there are holes in it, things like that, he said. He accepted that to his friend, his colleague in YouTube, in a friendly manner. But now, after 2 months, from the reactions, people keep saying that, using his words against Quran. And then he said, okay, I made my mind. I think these days I didn't have answers that time, but now I have my answers, and that's okay. And I saw, for example, one of his answers in Facebook. He says, for the traditional narrative, let me just read that part. The fact remains that we all agree on the demonstrably proven fact that the Quran has been preserved in its entirety, word for word, and that we believe that all of the 10 recitations, qiraat, of the Quran are revealed from Allah. But do you see the contradiction here? He said word by word, and then he said 10 of the qiraat has been revealed from Allah. So he says all the qiraat says correct, and all the words are, although they contradict at some small points to each other, they say all from Allah. And I think this is the kind of average narrative of the tradition. So what's your reaction to his first essay, confession, and then after making his mind? Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think he's a very honest person. I have met him. I even presented my opinion on the qiraat in his institute in Dallas last year. He invited me over. So in front of the senior class and he himself, I presented my view. He didn't agree with my view in a very polite way. He said he had his differences, but I think that I respect him very much because you see, a person is what he believes, frankly, and if he expresses his belief in a sense, in a way that reflects his inner self, that is the sign of a sincere person. If he is not satisfied with the traditional narrative, I think that this is a big quality of a person, that he openly expresses that he is not satisfied. And if he gives an answer which is not to our satisfaction, again, that is something which doesn't matter in the end, because you see, he has come up in his own understanding to be to a very cogent explanation, to a very satisfactory explanation. We might not be satisfied. We might be having questions. But you see, I think it shows that the person is very honest. At least he realizes that there are problems in the traditional narrative. But the answers he gives to these loopholes found in the traditional narrative might not satisfy me or you, but this is how the world of academia and knowledge progresses, that you critically think out patterns and formations of the past, you give your own input, and if your own input stands this test of time, it will survive. Otherwise, it will just fade away. Strong arguments are always destined to live, and weak arguments are not destined to live. I think that as far as Brother Yasir Qadhi is concerned, I would say that he's spoken his heart out. So instead of maybe criticizing him or condemning him, we should respect his views, and we might differ with them. But I think this is a tradition that we must establish especially in Muslim circles, that to differ politely and to let the other person express his opinion. And in this way, the whole, I would say, the torrent of human knowledge or human advancement is destined to go forward. Otherwise, we'll have that stagnation, that pool of stagnation in which we are all stuck up. So I see his endeavor to be a very encouraging thing.
One thing I want to ask that detail. When did you present in his institute?
I think it was maybe July or August of last year.
2019, right?
Maybe 1 year from now.
1 year before. Okay, then at that time, it means he didn't have the answers correctly, because he said in August, 2 months ago from the state, June 15, he had that confession in his video. He didn't have his mind correct. He didn't answer for all the questions he had. But 1 year before, you had all answers in your conclusion. He didn't agree with you. What was his objection to you?
Actually, we didn't talk in detail regarding his opinion very much. He tried to find out my opinion more because he had invited me. He just said that he is not very satisfied with my answers. I didn't deem it appropriate at that instance to find out more about what his own opinion is. So it was a friendly discussion and a meeting, and students were there. We had dinner with each other, so it's like a friendly atmosphere. But what I gathered in that meeting was that he too, because you see, one of the common things that brought us together was that I was not satisfied with the standard narrative, and he was not satisfied with the standard narrative. He was looking for answers, and I was looking for answers. And I spent about 20 years looking for those answers, and he thought that maybe my answers would satisfy him, but unfortunately they did not. So this is how it went.
Okay, that's good. Okay, I think I have all my questions answered in my opinion. What I want to ask you, do you have something to tell as addition that I didn't ask, but it's important that you would like to mention here as well?
Well, nothing as the only thing that maybe I would like to mention here is that I think the important thing that we need to realize is this thing that we call critical thinking. You see, critical thinking is a tool in which all of us try to reach the truth. And when we critique a previous opinion, the purpose is not to belittle that person, the purpose is not to demean that person, but the purpose is to find out the truth. So every endeavor which tries to give you a new side to an old problem should be looked upon not as a conspiracy, not as a thing that is meant to undermine people in any way, but as a new step forward. It could be a wrong step, it could be a right step at the same hand, in the same right. But you see, what we need to understand is that it is reasoning, argumentation, which should be the basis of conversation, instead of imposing ourselves, instead of insulting people, instead of calling them names. I think a person if he presents something new, you should question the view on the basis of the arguments that he has offered. And they might be weak arguments, and they might make him rethink his opinion. But the way forward is this discussion, this intellectual reasoning, this argument, not imposing our view on the other person, giving the other person the chance to breathe and to have his own opinion without labeling that person, and considering all of us on the same voyage. All of us are seekers of the truth. All of us want to go and find the truth. So this is a common goal. And as a common goal, we should help each other and respect each other. And it doesn't matter if we have different opinions, because in the end, at the end of the day, I'm going to be answerable for what I hold to God, and the other person is going to be answerable to his opinion. I'm not going to be answerable for other people's opinion. So I think if at all criticism is something that we should do, it should be self-criticism. It should be criticism which is based on rationality, reasoning, and in a very gentle way, in a very polite way, at the same time admitting that I can be wrong. I am not the last word. I'm not the final word. I'm just trying to make sense of the data that I have. So I think the academic way in which we should proceed is what I would request all my viewers and people who happen to listen to my talk, that unless we adopt this academic approach, this intellectual approach, we will just end up fighting and mutually insulting each other and not going any forward. This is something which is of supreme importance. Mutual respect on the basis of reasoning, and on the basis of the fact that every human being has the freedom to express an opinion, and that opinion can be absolutely wrong.
Yeah, sure. I agree with you on this. The last thing I want to just summarize from our conversation till now. For the narrative, I mean, based on your conclusion, if I want to make a narrative to someone else, let's say, if they ask me what is the narrative on this point, I can say, okay, we 97% of Muslims use the same exact Quran. That is the Quran. That's al-qraat, al-amma, traditionally. Right. But what about that 3%? For that 3%, as far as I understand from your lectures, they have been imposed from their rulers in around 3rd century, or some of them has been followed from some of the scholars. They were using the other qira'ats. Is that correct?
Yes. And that is because in the 3rd century, it was actually imposed at the state level. People were forced to adopt a certain qira'at. And only qira'ats can be adopted when they are forced upon people. You just cannot change the qira'at of a whole territory by simply summarily telling them that you should change the qira'at. It has to be a state order, a royal decree. So this royal decree was used to implement the qira'at of Nafi in the 3rd century, and ever since it is continuing. However, in the rest of the ummah, there was no such thing which had been adopted, and the qira'at which was left by the Prophet and his companions all through their ages has traveled through all these countries, especially, for example, countries in which scholars did not go, but the common man went first, like, for example, Malaysia or Indonesia, or even the Indo-Pak subcontinent. It was the common man who entered these territories first with the qira'at al-amma. And I would say how we should present it also.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a great conversation. I hope you find an opportunity to, in person, debate with the traditional people and also your peers. That would be interesting. Right. And thank you very much again for being my guest in my channel. That was great to have you, and nice to meet you as well.
It was a pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me. It was lovely talking to you.
Yeah, I hope in the future we can also meet in some opportunities. Thank you very much.
Inshallah. Okay, all the best. Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.
Okay, have a nice day.
Bye.
You too.